This Friday, Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan are back to switch things up in Disney's Freakier Friday.
Totally. Yes.
It's an absolute riot.
Woo!
And the only movie that can be described as
So much weirder than the last time. What last time?
it's the frequel
You ready?
we've been waiting for.
That absolutely slays.
What deeply out of touch old person came up with that?
You did.
Wow.
Don't miss the comedy event of the summer for all ages. Disney's Freakier Friday in theaters this Friday. Get tickets now. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested.
It's Wednesday Addams. I see you're trying to distract yourself from your own banal thoughts. Let me help. Here's a recording thing made of my latest root canal.
Wednesday, Season 2, begins August 6th, only on Netflix.
Good night, itchy eyes. Good night, sudden sneeze. Good night to your symptoms of allergies. Xyzal is the allergy medicine you take before bed. It provides powerful relief while you rest your head. Not just all night, but all the next day. Xyzal keeps working, keeping allergies at bay. And without those annoying symptoms disturbing your rest, you can wake up the next morning feeling your absolute best. Remember, be wise all. Take Xyzal. At night.
Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 105, The Shenandoah Park Murders.
Lolly and Julie's story is also this very beautiful love story. And I always want to make sure that that doesn't get lost in the shuffle either.
That's Catherine Miles, an investigative journalist and author. And she's referring to the love story of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. It's interesting to think about couples and how they meet, whether it's through friends or acquaintances, work, or when their interests and passions collide and they connect. It's even more dynamic and interesting when sparks fly and the couples at first, on the surface, seem totally different.
They were these sort of yin and yang people. Lolly was really outrageous. She was kind of the life of the party. You know, she loved fish and the Grateful Dead. She usually had a Corona in her hand. She was just larger than life and kind of, ridiculous in the best possible way. Julie was much more reserved, a little shy, academically minded, very family minded, and they met each other and just complemented each other in the best possible way. And were really kind of like two puzzle pieces who had been looking for each other for a very long time.
Lolly grew up in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and she was raised in a wealthy family, but always sort of rejected that life. In fact, she'd once been described as a misfit in a world of yacht clubs and boarding schools. When Lolly left home, she followed her true north, which had always been the outdoors. In 1994, she moved to Maine and enrolled at Unity College, where she was training to become a wilderness guide.
Lolly, meanwhile, had really found herself with wilderness therapy, and she was already planning on founding a wilderness therapy program for survivors of sexual assault.
Julie, on the other hand, grew up in Minnesota. She'd always been a high achiever. Majoring in geology, she had graduated at the top of her class. Julie spoke Spanish fluently and used her skills to help migrant workers. And by 24, she had traveled extensively around the world, backpacking and hiking.
Julie had volunteered as a Spanish translator for domestic violence survivors. She'd done a lot of geological volunteering field work, including on Native American land.
Both Lolly and Julie loved the outdoors and were passionate about environmental issues. It is these shared interests that would bring their worlds together. In 1995, Lolly was 26 and Julie was 24 when they met for the first time at Woods Women, an outdoor adventures program for women based in Minnesota. Woods Women was a place where students rock climbed, hiked, went canoeing, and received education on leading outdoor excursions. And it was here that Julie and Lolly would be assigned to share a tent And from the beginning, they hit it off as friends and then something more.
For Lolly and Julie, who had spent the first summer of their relationship, the summer of 1995, at this very wonderful, inclusive organization called Woods Women, which was very sort of queer friendly, they had this real honeymoon period where they could just really be in love.
Both Lolly and Julie kept their relationship private. Lolly would tell a few close friends, but Julie struggled as a woman of faith. She worried about how coming out might be perceived, especially when attitudes toward LGBTQ+ identity were often viewed with open hostility.
Because this was a time when Lolly and Julie were getting together in 1996 or 1995. It was not, I mean, we've come a long way, but it was a really scary time. And there, you gave this reference to Greg Louganis getting into the, I mean, it just brought me back to that time period. And I remember that when he made that dive and he hit his head.
And I think we forget, and yes, as you said, we have made great strides, obviously not nearly enough strides. And frankly, in the past couple of years, we've been doing a lot of backsliding where LGBTQ rights are concerned. But, 1996, the mid 1990s, were such a different era. I mean, this was 2 years before Matthew Shepard. As you mentioned with Greg Louganis, we're still very much on the cusp of what was really kind of AIDS hysteria. And so to be a same-sex couple during this time came with a lot of challenges that if you hadn't lived that experience in the mid 1990s, you might have kind of forgotten or never really thought about.
The hysteria Catherine's speaking of is the backlash that Olympic gold medalist Greg Louganis would receive in 1995 after an interview with Barbara Walters, where he would share for the first time that 6 months before the 1988 Olympic Games in Seoul, he'd been diagnosed with HIV, and that the stigma of being gay and HIV positive was so pervasive, he wouldn't reveal that he had HIV to the Olympic Committee and that he continued to dive after he'd hit his head, which required 4 stitches during the preliminary games.
The world was at his feet, but what people didn't know was that Greg Louganis, 4-time Olympic gold medalist, was one of the unhappiest men alive. For Louganis and his coach, Ron O'Brien, had kept a terrible secret.
On my reverse 2.5 pike, I knew as soon as I was coming off the board that I was going to be close, because I could feel it in my own body. So what I was concerned about is hitting my hands. So I came out wide so that the board would, go by and I wouldn't hit it. I started coming out of the dive and then I heard this big hollow thud. And then I found myself in the water. I just held my head in hopes to, I didn't know if I was cut or not, but I just wanted to hold the blood in or, just not anybody touch it.
You hit your head and there may have been blood in the water. Why were you terrified?
Because Ron O'Brien and myself were one of the few people in the stands that knew that I was HIV positive.
You were in the 1988 Olympics HIV positive.
This interview in 1995 with Barbara Walters was the first time that Greg publicly admitted that he had been diagnosed 6 months before the Olympics with HIV.
And when you hit your head, and there was blood perhaps in that water, what did you think?
That's where I became paralyzed with fear because, I knew that there was not too much of a chance, because it takes a while. If you cut yourself on your head, usually it takes a minute to start, bleeding. And, there is chlorine in the pool, all over, the deck's wet with chlorinated water.
And that would wipe out any of the virus?
Right. And if there was blood in the pool, there's a delusion effect that, the virus is so small and there's, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water, that it's being diluted by.
Olympic physician Dr. Jim Puffer stitched up a 2-inch cut in Louganis' head without wearing protective gloves. Did you tell the doctor?
No. I was so stunned. I mean, what was going on in my mind at the time was, what's my responsibility? Do I say something? It's, this has been an incredibly guarded secret. It could, throw the entire competition into, a state of alarm, even more so than just having hit my head on the board. I was paralyzed with fear.
He'd had 5 minutes to decide if he should continue, which he did, and would go on to win 2 gold medals in Seoul in 1988. Greg would keep this secret for 7 years, until he wrote his best-selling book, Breaking the Surface.
You did not have to write this book. You did not have to admit that you're HIV positive. Why are you doing it?
I wanted my story to, to motivate, those people who are HIV positive to be responsible, and also to, to understand that life isn't over yet. That HIV and AIDS is not a death sentence, and you can achieve.
You can even win Olympic medals.
Yeah. Some people don't think that AIDS has touched their lives. A lot of people saw me at the Olympics and they were cheering for me. So now all of those people can't say that they have not been affected by AIDS.
Which is all to say, in 1996, Lolly and Julie weren't prepared to come out as a couple.
What was really kind of AIDS hysteria. And so to be a same-sex couple during this time came with a lot of challenges that if you hadn't lived that experience in the mid-1990s, you might have kind of forgotten or never really thought about. And so for Lolly and Julie, who had spent the first summer of their relationship, the summer of 1995, at this very wonderful, inclusive organization called Woods Women, which was very sort of queer friendly. They had had this real honeymoon period where they could just really be in love. But after that, they had to really confront some really difficult things about what it was to be a same-sex couple during this time. And both of them were really kind of coming to terms with their own sexuality as well. So that was really challenging for them. And very few of their friends and none of their family knew that they were in a same-sex relationship. So they moved through the world largely as good friends.
Even so, Lolly and Julie's love continued to blossom. They spent their free time together hiking and camping in the woods where they felt free to be themselves. And they decided to move in together. They found a house to rent in Huntington, Vermont, as Julie's lease with her roommate would be up at the end of May. Meantime, Lolly and Julie made plans for a 10-day camping trip to hike the Appalachian Trail at the stunning Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. It was just the two of them and their dog Taj when they arrived at the Shenandoah National Park on May 19th, 1996. So there's a main road inside of the park called Skyline Drive, which leads to multiple visitor centers, historic sites, resorts, and most of the park's trailheads. Lolly and Julie parked near Skyland Lodge, which is a historic site within the park. Built in 1888, it's a unique resort that has 28 buildings nestled inside woodland around mile markers 41 and 42. The couple would set off near Stony Man Overlook, a name so given because at the top of the mountain, a rock outcropping facade has the image of what seems like a bearded man reclining on the slope of the Blue Ridge as if he's looking out over the Shenandoah Valley. The women hiked to the Pinnacle's Overlook, which had majestic views of the southern Blue Ridge Mountains. There were so many romantic spots to enjoy along the trail with these gorgeous views of sloping mountains that just appear to go on for miles and miles. It's the kind of place where writers and poets go to be inspired, and hikers in love, like Lolly and Julie, it's a sanctuary to enjoy each other's company, surrounded by the sounds of nature, and then the reward of another breathtaking view. At the top of a mountain, arms entwined, as they take in the peaks and valleys below of unspoiled beauty, just taking it all in, and each other. On May 24th, Lolly and Julie would run into a park ranger, and they would renew their camping permit before heading out for another climb. This time, up Hawksbill Mountain, the highest peak at Shenandoah National Forest. That night, Lolly and Julie set up their tent by a mountain stream. The perfect spot to lay your head and go to sleep to the sound of water rushing over river rocks next to the person that you love. Lolly and Julie were supposed to have returned home to Vermont on May 28th. When the women didn't show up for their respective jobs, friends and family were concerned, but they knew both women were highly skilled hikers. And given their level of outdoor experience, if they had gotten into any kind of a scrape, they, of all people, would be able to navigate out of it. But when Julie wasn't home by May 31st, that was moving day for her. And her roommate would call her dad and say that she hadn't shown up. And they were expected to be out of the apartment that day. Right away, Julie's dad would report his daughter and Lolly missing to the park rangers at the Shenandoah National Park. Rangers began searching for Julie and Lolly, and they quickly found the vehicle that they'd parked near Skyland Lodge. Rangers knew that the women had been last seen on May 24th, 4 days before they had been scheduled to return home to Vermont. On June 1st, at around 9 p.m., roughly a quarter of a mile from Skyline Drive, a park ranger spotted a little pitched tent near a bubbling creek. He made his way to the camp. Inside the tent, he would find Lolly's body. And outside, nearby, he found Julie. Both women had been bound and gagged. Their throats were cut. The couple's dog, Taj, would be found unharmed close by.
We have always suspected that Julie was the true target of this crime. Lolly was found murdered in the tent. Julie was taken about 20 yards away along with her sleeping pad. We believe that Julie was kept alive longer. There was a vibrator that didn't appear to belong to either women that was staged very prominently at the murder scene. We believe that may have been left on purpose by the perpetrator. There were these very strange restraint marks that were found using UV light on Julie's sleeping pad that look a whole lot like leather bondage straps. But again, we cannot confirm, so far as I know, that either woman was sexually assaulted. We've always assumed that Julie was, but there was not the forensic evidence to ever support that.
Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
It's back to school season, and Clorox is donating 2 million disinfecting wipes to classrooms across America. Because back to school means things can get a little bit messy. Just ask second grade teacher Mr. Torres.
Put me and just one Clorox wipe on a team? We can take on crayon smudges, sticky fingerprints on every surface, sneezes on the door handle, juice box explosion by the sink, snack crumbs, and don't even get me started on the bathroom passes.
Clorox disinfecting wipes. Teacher's #1 wipe.
Think about it. Bathroom passes.
Clean feels good. Based on unit sales data.
Get lost in the acoustic brilliance of 3D audio that surrounds you. Feel the embrace of the massage seats that adapt to your every move. Experience the warmth of a vehicle that welcomes you as you approach. We could tell you what makes a Lincoln SUV so extraordinary, but don't take our word for it. Take it on a test drive at the Lincoln Summer Invitation with exclusive offers on now, only at your local Lincoln retailer.
Deborah had to have surgery.
I had hip surgery in November of 2024.
Her United Healthcare nurse, Crystal, checked on her.
We do a routine call after surgery, and I could tell that she was struggling.
Deborah needed help.
My infection markers were through the roof.
And Crystal knew what to do.
I called the hospital and said she's coming in.
And got Deborah the help she needed.
Crystal and United Healthcare saved my life.
Hear more stories like Deborah's at uhc.com. Benefits, features, and/or devices vary by plan area. Limitation and exclusions apply.
After the murders, local media were desperate to get a straight answer about the circumstances behind the deaths of these two women at the park. Initial reports had said that the women had died from a bear attack, and then that the killings were a result of a murder-suicide.
In the book, I quote from a confidential internal memo at the National Park Service where those highest in command at the park made the decision to hide this information from park goers and the public, even though this was one of the busiest weekends of the year. And one of the braids and the strands in this book that I detail is the experience of a group of women hikers who were there at the time and who had encountered people who had been talking about these murders, and yet rangers continued to deny that they existed. And as you mentioned, it wasn't until 4 days after the bodies were found that, again, because of the dogged pursuit of these local reporters, especially the Washington Blade, which is an LGBTQ plus newspaper outside of Washington, it was because those reporters kept asking and saying, weren't the women found bound and gagged in their sleeping bags? Yes. Well, are you really saying a bear did this? Are you really saying that this could possibly be a bear attack or a murder-suicide? It was because of their hard work and their sort of relentless pursuit of the truth that anyone found out about this at all.
The double homicide would set off a multi-jurisdictional manhunt in which the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the National Park Services joined forces as the agencies in charge of the case. But without a lot of information coming from authorities, there was a lot of speculation about the murders. Were the murders of Julie and Lolly related to 4 double homicides that had taken place nearby in the 1980s?
So beginning in 1986, there were a series of murders now known as the Colonial Parkway murders. The Colonial Parkway is also national park land, and it began with the double murder of Kathy Thomas and Becky Dowski, who were also in a same-sex relationship, also 2 very strong, accomplished women. The crime itself was disturbingly similar to Lolly and Julie in terms of its MO. And so a lot of people have wanted to link those 2 crimes. They were almost exactly a decade apart. They both happened on long holiday weekends. Again, the MO was identical. And so some people have speculated that that was the same assailant. There were other Colonial Parkway crimes too that get lumped into that as well too. So that's one set of crimes.
And there were many other unsolved murders in the area. In fact, authorities had long speculated that a serial killer could be operating in Virginia. Lolly and Julie's murders would spark panic within the hiking community, but there seemed to be no answers as to who was responsible.
From everyone I've talked to who saw them at Shenandoah and who knew them in public, they had all said, look, you never would have known that Lolly and Julie were a couple. And in fact, it took investigators quite a while to figure out that they were a couple as well. So all of that to say that initially, for the first 5 years, this case was not treated as a hate crime.
In July of 1997, a little over a year after the murders, a woman named Yvonne was cycling along Skyline Drive when a man in a truck tried to run her off the road. He was threatening and then threw a soda bottle at her. He rushed into her, pulled his truck over, grabs her by the chest, and starts trying to pull her inside of his vehicle. Yvonne would fight back, using her water bottle and bike to fend him off. And then she took cover behind a tree as this man continued to try to run her over with his vehicle. Eventually, he would take off. Yvonne was able to find a park ranger pretty quickly, and she reported the assault. That park ranger would immediately radio the other rangers within the park, and fortunately, they were able to pull this guy over before he could leave. And they took him into custody. The suspect would be identified as Daryl Rice, and when they searched his truck, they found hand and leg constraints that were hidden inside. They also noted that he changed his clothes and reattached license plates, which he had removed before he had attacked Yvonne. In 1998, Daryl Rice would plead guilty to the attempted abduction of Yvonne, and he was sentenced to 11 years in a federal prison in Virginia. Obviously, after Rice's arrest, authorities began looking into him as a potential suspect in Lolly and Julie's murders, especially after surveillance video would show Daryl Rice driving into the Shenandoah National Park on May 25th at 8:05 p.m. and again on May 26th at 4:57 p.m. He returned to the park on June 1st with his friends.
Once he committed this crime of harassing the cyclist, the FBI and the Park Service law enforcement rangers were immediately convinced that Rice was their guy. And so they were going to do everything they possibly could to hold him in prison while they tried to coerce a confession for the double murders.
In April of 2002, Attorney General John Ashcroft would hold a press conference where he announced the indictment of Daryl Rice for the 1996 double homicides of Lolly and Julie. At the time, Daryl was still serving out his 11-year sentence when he was charged with their capital murders. Ashcroft would say that Rice, quote, intentionally selected his victims because of his hatred of women and homosexuals, and that the indictment invoked federal sentencing enhancement enacted to ensure justice for victims of hate crimes.
But the legal definition of a hate crime says that you must be able to prove that a perpetrator targeted individuals because they belong to a certain protected group, either because of their sexuality, their religion, or their race, usually.
Which meant if Daryl Rice was convicted, he could face the death penalty.
In 2001, right, we have the September 11th attacks. And right after that, there is a huge spike in hate crimes, largely against Muslim and Middle Eastern Americans and people who frankly just look like they're Muslim or Middle Eastern. And the then Bush administration was under a ton of pressure to prove that they were going to be willing to be tough on hate crimes and exercise the brand new legislation that had just been created surrounding hate crimes, and that was to allow for enhanced sentencing for crimes that seemed to be hate motivated. And so it was the first opportunity that the federal government had, for instance, to seek the death penalty in murder cases that seemed to be driven by hatred for one of these protected groups. So in the spring of 2002, you have the Bush administration under this tremendous pressure to demonstrate that they're willing to be tough on hate crimes. And for reasons that have never been clear to me, then Attorney General Ashcroft and his office settled on Lolly and Julie's case as the case in which they would try to exercise this new legislation.
But these murder charges against Rice were eventually dropped in 2003 after forensic testing showed that hairs found at the crime scene ruled him out as a possible suspect.
What ended up being the cause was the fact that they had consistently tested the DNA from the evidence taken at the crime scene against Daryl Rice's, and it never matched. In fact, the FBI lab kept telling the agents involved, he is clearly not, the suspect based on this. He can be completely excluded from all of this evidence. And this evidence was really damning. It included male saliva that was found in the gags and the binding on the women. It included hair that was found in the duct tape that was used to bind the women. Gloves were found at the scene that had knuckle hairs. There was a bottle of Mountain Dew that was in a Walmart bag that did not belong to Lolly or Julie. None of that evidence matched Daryl Rice's.
Incredibly, just a few months ago, Catherine would find out that after 28 years, out of the blue, it appeared that there was a potential break in the Lolly and Julie murder investigation.
So on the morning of June 20th of this year, the FBI announced that they were going to have a press conference in about an hour, which is very typical FBI. They were going to have a press conference in about an hour, and the press release had listed a series of very high-ranking officials from a variety of different departments. So Once I received news of this press conference, which did not come from the FBI, it came from national reporters and producers who were texting me, asking me if I knew what the press conference was about. Once I saw this actual press release, which I had to get from the father of a victim, it became very clear to me that they were going to make a major announcement that they had solved the case.
At this press conference in June of 2024, it was announced that 3 years earlier, a new FBI team in Virginia had been tasked with reviewing the Lolly and Julie murder investigation, and that several pieces of evidence from the crime scene had been sent to a private lab for testing, and that multiple items that were sent had come back with the same genetic profile that was believed to be the killer. That DNA profile was then uploaded into CODIS, and they got a hit. A man named Walter Leo Jackson Sr. was not only a match, but that the recent DNA testing would find that there was only a 1 in 2.6 trillion chance that the DNA found at the crime scene came from someone other than Jackson. Jackson was a convicted rapist originally from Cleveland, Ohio. That's why his DNA had been collected and entered into a national database for those crimes.
Some pieces or piece of evidence that was taken from the crime scene, they would not tell us what, was tested at a private lab. They wouldn't tell us why they used a private lab. And that the results of this test, and we don't know what test was run, led them to conclude that Leo Jackson Sr., a known serial rapist who had committed at least 4 rapes in the state of Ohio, had perpetrated this very sophisticated, very organized double homicide of 2 very strong backcountry leaders who also had a dog with them. I think that begs a lot of questions just right there. What the forensic experts have told me is that it's a pretty big hop from serial rape to very sophisticated double homicide that leaves not a lot of evidence. So that suggests that Jackson may well have committed other sort of half-step crimes prior to Lolly and Julie. As so far as we know, he's not being investigated. We don't know if Jackson acted alone. We don't know if the strength of the evidence taken really does close this case. Another thing that was very curious to me about the press conference is that they announced that were Jackson alive, he would be charged not only with murder, but also with rape. That's new. Darrell Rice was notably never charged with rape. The medical examiner's report makes no mention of any semen or sperm cells found, any forced penetration. And so, again, we don't know why the federal government was able to come to this conclusion. And while I'm not saying that I don't believe Jackson committed this, I am saying that we have not been given enough information to come to conclusions about whether or not this really does seem like the case has been solved. And furthermore, if we ought to be wondering how many other women were murdered by Jackson as well.
Investigators had pieced together Jackson's history and timeline. Apparently, after he'd murdered Julie and Lolly, the following month, in June of 1996, he kidnapped and raped a woman as he held a knife to her throat. And he would do this again the following month to a different woman in July of 1996. And he would remain at large for that crime. But 15 years later, Jackson violently abducted and raped another woman. This time, he was arrested and convicted for that attack. And he was also linked to the incidents in June and July of 1996. But by 2024, Jackson was dead. He died in prison in 2018. Here's Stanley Metter, the FBI special agent in charge of this investigation.
Well, I think that this is a great example of our tenacity not to give up on any case. I would hesitate to say that the term cold case, because if it's an open case, the FBI is moving forward on that case. I do think it is a reminder to everyone, not just in federal law enforcement, but into law enforcement, that of the persistence that cases need, and that is what we do. As U.S. Attorney Kavanaugh even alluded to, we don't give up.
But there are still so many unanswered questions.
So there was no semen noted in the medical examiner's report. anywhere.
Right. And it's possible that a rape kit was completed. And while the rape kit did not show any of these cells using 1996 or even 2004 technology, it is possible that the advances in trace DNA analysis allowed for some of Jackson's cells to be found in these rape kits. But again, we don't know. And until the federal government chooses to tell us, we will never know. And instead, we just sort of have to take their word for it. And again, as an investigative journalist, I'm not real fond of taking the FBI or frankly anyone's word for it. I'm always a big fan of show me your work.
Well, and why would they withhold it? Why would they?
It's a great question.
Why would they not say this is how we came to this conclusion? And
I and multiple other journalists have asked that question since the press conference. And what we have been repeatedly told is that the FBI will not have any further comment on this case.
The FBI would say at that news conference that there was no evidence that the women had been targeted because of their sexual orientation. U.S. Attorney Christopher Kavanaugh says, quote, "Make no mistake, this crime was brutal. This crime was definitely hateful. Nevertheless, we do not have any evidence that the crime was motivated by anti-gay bias."
One thing that's very clear is that this case was absolutely a hate crime in the sense that for an entire generation of people, especially people who identify as women or non-binary or queer, this had the effect of really kind of removing access to the wilderness for them. And I still am struck by how many people either stay after talks and lectures or who contact me to say, I remember this case, I haven't gone back to the wilderness since then, or I used to be a backcountry camper, I don't do it anymore, I don't feel safe anymore in the wilderness. And so in that regard, it really had the social impact of a hate crime.
In that area of Virginia, there are a lot of unsolved murder cases, and the FBI has committed to working with other law enforcement agencies on cases that could involve Walter Leo Jackson.
This is a very rural area of Virginia, and when you take central and eastern Virginia, beginning in 1986, there was an extraordinary spike in crime, particularly murder and particularly crimes against women. It's so much to unpack. And as far as I'm concerned, this is not concluded, right? We still have so many questions we need answered with Lolly and Julie. We have these other cases that have not been solved. We have now the prospect that Leo Jackson committed other murders. And so I and the Innocence Project continue to investigate this. And, until we have really viable answers for everyone involved, this is really going to be sort of the foreground work that I intend to do.
But when authorities were asked about whether the same DNA testing could have been done years ago in Lolly and Julie's case and identified the suspect earlier, they were pretty vague. So we will definitely keep you posted on any updates in this case. But don't go anywhere, because up next, we have Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host Brandon Morgan and I will discuss the case in more detail. And as always, thanks for listening. From Cloud 10, Criminal Mischief is a pie-in-the-sky production recorded in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.